My name is Stefano Moretti, and for 23 years I worked as a necropsy technician at the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, Italy. I've prepared hundreds of bodies for their final rest. I've touched the cold flesh of accident victims, the rigid limbs of the elderly, the tragic stillness of those taken too soon. Death in my profession becomes routine. The body becomes an object, a case number, a set of procedures to follow. You learn to disconnect, to see tissue and organs rather than souls and stories. You have to, or you couldn't do the job at all. But there was one body that changed everything I thought I knew about death. One touch that shattered 23 years of professional detachment. One moment that forced me to question whether I had ever truly understood what happens when life leaves the flesh. It was October 12th, 2006. A Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were always busy in the morgue. The overflow from the weekend starting to clear, new cases coming in from the week's accidents and emergencies. I had arrived at 7 in the morning, as always, put on my scrubs, checked the schedule. 3 bodies to prepare that day, 2 elderly patients who had died of natural causes, expected deaths, families already notified, and 1 young person, a teenager, cause of death listed as leukemia. The 3rd case caught my attention only because of the age, 15 years old. In 23 years I had learned that young deaths hit differently, even for someone like me who prided myself on professional distance. Parents would come, destroyed by grief, and even the most hardened technician felt something crack inside. But I had my procedures, my protocols, my way of managing the emotional weight. I would do my job with extra care, with extra respect, knowing that somewhere a mother and father were experiencing the worst day of their lives. The boy's name was Carlo Acutis. I didn't recognize it then. He was just another case, another young life cut short by disease. The paperwork indicated he had died early that morning, around 6:30. Leukemia, fulminant type, incredibly aggressive. He had been admitted to our hospital just days before. His body would arrive in my morgue within the hour. I prepared my workstation as I always did. Stainless steel table cleaned and disinfected, instruments laid out in precise order, the room temperature set to the standard cool that slows decomposition. Gloves, gown, mask, all the barriers between my living flesh and the dead. I had done this preparation thousands of times. It was muscle memory, a ritual that allowed my mind to go blank, to enter the zone of professional competence where emotion couldn't interfere. At 8:15, the orderlies wheeled in the gurney. The body was covered with the standard white sheet, the form underneath slight, too slight, the shape of a child more than a young man. I thanked the orderlies and asked them to transfer the body to my table. They did so with the careful respect we always showed the young ones, then left me alone with my work. I stood there for a moment, as I always did, taking a breath, centering myself. Then I pulled back the sheet. He looked asleep. That was my first thought. Not dead, but sleeping. His face was peaceful, serene, without any of the tension or pain I usually saw in disease victims, especially cancer patients who had fought hard battles against their illness. His skin was pale but not waxy, not yet showing the grayish hue that death usually brings within hours. His dark hair was slightly tousled, boyish, innocent. He looked like he might open his eyes at any moment and ask where he was, but he was dead. The paperwork confirmed it. The hospital wouldn't have sent him to me otherwise. I shook off the strange impression and began my initial examination, the visual assessment we do before any physical contact. I noted his slight build, the evidence of recent medical intervention, the IV marks on his arms, the slight bruising that leukemia often causes. Everything was consistent with the cause of death. Everything was normal, except for his face, that extraordinary peace. I made my notes on the preliminary examination form, clinical observations, measurements, the standard documentation. Then it was time for the next phase, the physical preparation. This is where the real work begins, where you must touch the body, position it, begin the process of preparing it for viewing, for the funeral, for the family's final goodbye. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves. I always used 2 pairs for extra protection, a habit from my early days that I had never broken. I positioned myself at the head of the table, ready to begin with the upper body, checking for rigor mortis, assessing the condition of the tissues, beginning the gentle manipulation that would make the viewing easier for the family. I reached out and placed my hands on his shoulders, and everything I knew about death became irrelevant. The first thing I felt was warmth, not the warmth of living flesh, but not the cold of death either. Something in between. Something that shouldn't have been possible. He had been dead for nearly 2 hours. By every law of biology I understood, by every body I had ever touched in 17 years, he should have been cool to the touch, the body temperature already dropping toward room temperature. But he wasn't cold. He was warm. Not hot, not feverish, but gently, impossibly warm. I pulled my hands back as if burned. My heart was racing. I looked at my gloved hands, then back at the body, then at the thermostat on the wall. The room was at its standard temperature, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. I checked the paperwork again. Time of death, 6:32 a.m. Current time, 8:23 a.m. Nearly 2 hours. The body should be cold. I told myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe the blankets they had used to transport him. Maybe something about the hospital room temperature. Maybe the disease had affected his body's cooling process. I was a man of science, a professional. There had to be an explanation. I reached out again, this time placing my palm against his forehead, the classic gesture of checking for fever. Though I was checking for the opposite, for the expected coldness of death, the warmth was still there, gentle, consistent, undeniable, and with it, something else, something I had no clinical term for, no entry in my years of medical training, a sense of presence, of peace, of something that made no sense in the cold reality of a morgue at 8:20 in the morning. I moved my hand to his cheek. The skin was soft, pliable, nothing like the beginning of rigor mortis that should have been setting in. In death, muscles stiffen, starting with the smallest muscles and working through the body over hours. By 2 hours post-mortem, there should be noticeable stiffness, especially in a young person whose muscle tissue was healthy before death, but his cheek yielded to my touch like he was sleeping, like he was alive, like he might turn his head toward my palm in unconscious response. My hands were shaking. I noticed it with the detached part of my mind that was still trying to maintain professional composure. Stefano Moretti, 23 years in the morgue, hands shaking like a first-year student, but I couldn't stop touching him. I needed to understand. I needed to confirm what I was feeling, to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. I moved to his hands. In my experience, extremities cool fastest. The hands and feet are always the coldest parts of a corpse, the first places where death becomes obvious to the touch. I lifted his right hand from where it lay at his side. The arm moved easily. No resistance, no stiffness. I cradled his hand in both of mine, feeling the weight of it, the bone structure, the delicate fingers of a young person who would never grow old. And the warmth was there too, in his fingers, in his palm, in his wrist where I gently pressed to feel for a pulse I knew wouldn't be there. The warmth and that inexplicable sense of peace that seemed to radiate from his skin into mine, through 2 layers of latex gloves, through 23 years of professional detachment, straight into some part of me I didn't even know existed anymore. I placed his hand back down and stepped away from the table. I needed to think. I needed to understand what was happening. Was I having some kind of breakdown? Had the years of working with death finally caught up with me in some psychological way? Was I projecting something onto this boy because of his age? Because of the tragedy of his death? But my hands remembered the warmth. My professional training remembered that warmth was impossible. And some deeper part of me, the part I had silenced for 23 years in order to do my job, was whispering that I was touching something holy. I forced myself back to the table. I had a job to do. Family would be coming. Procedures had to be followed. I couldn't stand here having an existential crisis over body temperature anomalies and emotional impressions. I was a technician, a professional, a man who dealt in facts and protocols. I began the standard preparation routine, trying to lose myself in the familiar tasks, cleaning, positioning, examining for any injuries or marks that might disturb the family during viewing. As I worked, my hands continued their impossible experience. Every touch brought the same warmth, the same softness, the same sense that this was not a corpse I was preparing but something else entirely, something my vocabulary had no words for. I washed his face with the gentle soap we used, the motion careful and reverent. His features remained peaceful under my touch, that slight smile still present at the corners of his mouth. I had seen many dead faces in my career. Some peaceful, yes, especially the elderly who had died in their sleep. But this was different. This wasn't the peace of cessation, of systems shutting down, of the body finally releasing its struggle. This was the peace of someone who knew something, who had seen something, who was resting in absolute certainty. As I worked on his hair, arranging it so he would look presentable. I found myself wondering about him for the first time, not as a case but as a person. Who was Carlo Acutis? What kind of boy had he been? What had he loved? What had he dreamed about? What had filled his 15 years of life? The paperwork told me nothing except the medical facts. Leukemia, rapid decline, death at San Gerardo Hospital. But it didn't tell me why touching his body felt like touching something sacred. I moved to his torso, checking the condition of his chest, his abdomen, making sure there were no visible issues that would require special attention. My hands pressed gently against his rib cage, feeling for the expected stiffness, and found instead that same impossible pliability. His body moved under my touch like a living person's would, the tissues soft and responsive. There was no rigidity, no resistance, nothing that matched the timeline of death I had memorized from textbooks and confirmed through thousands of practical experiences. This wasn't possible. That thought kept repeating in my mind like a mantra. This wasn't medically possible. Rigor mortis wasn't optional. Body temperature didn't maintain itself without circulation. Dead tissue didn't feel like living tissue. These were facts, biological certainties, the foundation of everything I knew about my profession, and yet my hands were telling me a different truth. I checked his legs, his feet, moving with the thoroughness my training demanded even as my mind reeled with impossibility. The warmth was consistent throughout his body. The softness was universal. There was no sign of the biological processes of death that should have been well underway. If I hadn't known he was dead, if I hadn't seen the paperwork, if I hadn't been standing in a morgue with a body delivered from the hospital's death ward, I would have sworn I was touching someone alive. But he was dead. I could see that he wasn't breathing. There was no pulse, no heartbeat, no rise and fall of the chest. Death was present. And yet life seemed to be also in some way I couldn't comprehend, couldn't categorize, couldn't fit into any framework I possessed. I completed the basic preparation and stood back to assess my work. He looked perfect, peaceful, beautiful in the way that young people are beautiful, that quality of potential and innocence that death usually steals but seemed to have left intact in him. If his family came now, they would see their son as he had been, not ravaged by disease, not marked by death's usual cruelty, but simply at rest. But I knew they would feel what I had felt, the moment they touched him, the moment a mother laid her hand on her son's cheek, or a father gripped his son's shoulder. They would feel that impossible warmth. And what would they think? Would they believe he wasn't really dead? Would it give them hope that was cruel because it was false? Or would they understand somehow that this was something else, something beyond the normal process of death? I pulled off my gloves and washed my hands at the sink, the hot water and soap a ritual of returning to the normal world, to the world where dead bodies were cold and stiff and made sense. But even as I dried my hands, I knew something had changed in me. I couldn't go back to seeing death as just biological cessation. I couldn't return to the comfortable detachment of the professional who had seen it all and remained unmoved. I had touched something I didn't understand, and in touching it, it had touched me back. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I prepared the other two bodies with my usual competence, but my mind kept returning to the boy in the chapel room where I had moved him after preparation, Carlo Acutis. I found myself saying his name in my mind, no longer just a case number, but a person, a mystery, a question I couldn't answer. During my lunch break, I did something I had never done before. I looked him up. I used the computer in the staff room to search for his name, to find out who this boy had been. What I found shocked me. He wasn't just any 15-year-old. He was known, at least in certain circles. There were websites, articles, mentions of him in Catholic publications. He had been deeply religious, devoted to the Eucharist, something about cataloging Eucharistic miracles on a website he had created. He had a reputation for holiness, for faith, for a spiritual maturity far beyond his years. People who knew him spoke of him with reverence even before his death, and they were already talking about sainthood. Even in those first hours after his death, people were suggesting that Carlo Acutis might one day be recognized as a saint by the Catholic Church. I sat back from the computer, my coffee growing cold in my hand. A saint. Was that what I had touched? Was that why his body defied everything I knew about death? I wasn't a particularly religious man. I went to Mass occasionally, mostly for family events, weddings and funerals. I believed in God in the vague way that most Italians do, a cultural inheritance more than a lived conviction. But I had never thought much about saints, about holiness, about the possibility that some people carried something divine within them, until I touched Carlo Acutis and felt that warmth, that peace, that presence that had no medical explanation. The afternoon brought his family, his mother, his father, his younger siblings. I watched from the hallway as they entered the chapel room, as they approached the body of their son and brother. I watched the mother reach out with trembling hands to touch his face. I watched her freeze, her eyes widening, and I knew she felt it too. The warmth, the impossible, beautiful, terrifying warmth. She didn't pull away. Instead, she cradled his face in her hands and wept. But there was something in her tears that wasn't just grief. There was wonder. There was recognition. There was confirmation of something she might have already known about her son, about his specialness, about the grace that had lived in him and now seemed to linger in his body even after death. The father's response was different. He gripped his son's shoulder as fathers do, that gesture of masculine affection and pride. And then he did what I had done. He pulled back, startled, confused. He looked at his wife, a question in his eyes. She nodded, tears still streaming down her face, and the father placed his hand back on his son's shoulder and kept it there, as if drawing strength from that contact, as if the warmth was a final gift from the boy he had raised. I left them to their grief and their mystery. It wasn't my place to intrude, to explain, to analyze. What I had felt was between me and that body, between my professional understanding and the crack that had opened in it, letting in light I hadn't known existed. Over the next few days, I learned more about Carlo Acutis. His funeral was huge, hundreds of people, media coverage, a sense that something significant had occurred. The Bishop of Milan presided. People spoke of miracles, of holiness, of a life lived in profound faith despite its brevity. And I knew things they didn't know. I knew that his body had been warm when it should have been cold. I knew that his flesh had been soft when it should have been rigid. I knew that touching him had felt like touching something holy, even to a man who had touched hundreds of bodies and never felt anything but clinical detachment. I went to his funeral. I stood in the back of the church, still in my role as the unseen technician, the behind-the-scenes professional who prepares the dead for the living to mourn. I listened to the homily, to the stories about his life, his faith, his love for Jesus in the Eucharist, his devotion to Mary. I heard how he had offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, how he had faced death with courage and hope, how he had told his mother that he was going to be with Jesus. And I thought about those hands I had held, that face I had washed, that body that had refused to be just dead flesh but had somehow remained a vessel of something more, something that made my professional knowledge seem trivial and my 17 years of experience seem like preparation for one moment of encounter with the inexplicable. Years have passed since that October day in 2006. Carlo Acutis was beatified in 2020, recognized officially by the Catholic Church as blessed, one step away from sainthood. His body was exhumed for the beatification and found to be remarkably preserved, incorrupt in the way that saints' bodies sometimes are, defying the normal processes of decay. I wasn't surprised. I had touched that body hours after death and already felt its refusal to conform to biological expectations. People ask me now, when they learn what I do for a living, if I've ever experienced anything unusual in all my years working with the dead. I usually say no. I usually keep my professional reputation intact, maintain the image of the rational technician who deals in facts and procedures. But sometimes with people I trust, with people who seem ready to hear it, I tell them about Carlo Acutis. I tell them that I touched a saint, that I held the hands of someone holy, that I felt warmth where there should have been cold, softness where there should have been rigidity, peace where there should have been nothing but the biological shutdown of systems. I tell them that in 23 years of working with death, I learned more about life in one morning with one boy than in all my previous experience combined. Because touching Carlo Acutis taught me that death isn't what I thought it was. That some people carry something within them that doesn't die when their hearts stop beating. That holiness is real, tangible, something you can feel with your hands if you're fortunate enough to encounter it. That the body isn't just meat and bones and biological processes, but can be a temple, a dwelling place for something divine that leaves traces even after it departs. I'm not a theologian. I can't explain the doctrine of the communion of saints or the theological significance of incorruption. I'm just a technician who prepares bodies for burial. But I know what my hands told me. I know what I felt when I touched Carlo Acutis. And that knowledge changed me in ways I'm still discovering years later. I'm more careful now with every body I prepare. I wonder about the lives lived, the souls that inhabited the flesh now cold under my hands. I say prayers sometimes, quiet words I barely remember from childhood catechism, asking God to receive these people, to welcome them home. I attend Mass more regularly, sitting in the back pew, still unsure of what I believe but knowing that I encountered something in that morgue that the Church calls holy, and I simply call real. And I tell this story, not often and not to everyone, but when the moment is right, when I sense that someone needs to hear it, I speak about the morning I prepared a saint's body for burial and learned that death is not the end of holiness, that grace leaves fingerprints on flesh, that touching the dead can sometimes teach you more about life than years of living. My name is Stefano Moretti. I worked for 23 years as a necropsy technician at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza. I've touched hundreds of bodies, prepared countless people for their final rest, but only one of them touched me back, reaching across the divide between life and death to tell me, without words, that everything I thought I knew was incomplete. Carlo Acutis was warm when he should have been cold, and in that impossible warmth, I felt the presence of something I can only call holy. It wasn't a vision. It wasn't a voice. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was the testimony of flesh, the evidence of hands, the undeniable experience of touching something that refused to be merely dead. I don't know if my testimony matters in the grand scheme of his canonization process. I never filed an official report. I never told the church authorities what I experienced. I was just a technician doing his job, a professional who happened to encounter something that shattered his professionalism and opened his eyes to realities he had spent his career ignoring. But I know what I felt, and I know what it meant to me, and I know that somewhere in the mystery of how God works in the world, my encounter with Carlo Acutis's body was meant to happen, was meant to teach me, was meant to crack open my certainties, and let in the light of something beyond my understanding. That's what I felt when I touched him. Warmth, peace, presence, holiness, the undeniable testimony of grace made tangible in flesh that refused to surrender completely to death. And in feeling it, I was changed. I'm still changing. Every day, every body I prepare, every moment of my work is now filtered through the memory of those hands, that face, that impossible warmth. Some encounters mark you forever. Some moments divide your life into before and after. For me, that moment came in a morgue at 8:23 on an October morning, when I placed my hands on the shoulders of a dead 15-year-old boy and felt the presence of a saint. I tell you this story not to convince you of anything. Believe it or don't believe it. Accept it as truth or dismiss it as the delusion of an emotional moment. It doesn't matter to me anymore what others think. I know what I experienced. I know what my hands told me. I know what changed in me in those minutes of impossible contact with the body of Carlo Acutis. And I know that death is not what we think it is, that holiness is real, that some people walk among us carrying grace in their bones, and that sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we get to touch that grace and be transformed by it. That's what happened to me. That's what I felt. That's why I'm telling you this story now, years later, still trying to understand it, still feeling the echo of that warmth in my memory, still changed by the morning I prepared a saint's body for burial, and learned that everything I thought I knew about death was incomplete. Carlo Acutis was warm when he should have been cold, and in that warmth, I felt the hand of God. If this testimony has moved your heart, consider praying for Carlo Acutis' intercession in your own life. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and activate notifications for more stories that illuminate the mysteries of faith and bring us closer to the saints who walk among us.